Before we talk, everybody knows the film just won 3 Academy Awards. Right. So let's talk a little bit about the reception of the film in Mexico itself, and how the film is viewed there as a Mexican film.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. The impact of a film. I think a very interesting element of the filmmaker of Cuarón and the Three Amigos in general is that somehow they've been able to position their films within the zeitgeist of the Mexican moment. The same way as Amores Perros in 2000 and Y Tu Mamá También a year later in 2001 became kind of iconic of Mexico in the early 2000s. They became like the films during the Fox period. Roma kind of became the iconic film of this new era in Mexican politics. For those of you to know, Mexico had elections last year, and the candidate from the left won, and so that's signaling kind of a major political change in Mexico. And so basically same time, Roma comes out and immediately becomes kind of iconic of this new change or this new political era. So in that sense, it's pretty amazing how the filmmakers, they're able to put the films in the table. But also, I think we're arguably talking about the most successful film in the history of Mexico. Right. It's still kind of probably too early to take some distance, but I think it's safe to say that it's the most successful, at least internationally, film, and that has had a major effect also in Mexico. And the film is changing. The fact that Yalitza, who was nominated for Best Actress. The fact that still mainstream media in Mexico is still largely white and light-skinned Mexicans. The fact that having Yalitza as a protagonist, that's also created a big discussion in terms of race, representation, and which is very important in Mexico.
Well, let me just do a kind of follow-up question to that, which has to do with not only the fact that she is of indigenous descent, but just the portrayal of indigenous people or her class, and also the fact that this is what a lot of Americans would not think so much about, which is a bilingual film. Right. That is, and in this film, Spanish is the urban dominant language, sure. And of course, she's speaking it's Mixteca, a dialect of Mixteca.
Right. Yeah. Which is interesting just to note. She doesn't speak Mixteco. She's of Mixteco origin, Mixteco and Triqui, but she doesn't speak Mixteco. She had to learn a bit for the role.
That I did. And so, talk a little about the status of say indigenous languages in the Mexican cinema. The fact that this is.
It's complicated. On one hand, you have a big tradition of Mexican media. Yeah. There's some great filmmakers, indigenous filmmakers, but sadly, they're not really well known in Mexico. Actually, here in New York, there used to be a native showcase that the the National Museum of American Indian would put together, and that was a great place to see all this work. So on one hand, you have that tradition. On the second, you have also kind of a tradition of indigenous cinema. Right. That comes from the 40s and 50s and probably earlier. That's still kind of alive and kicking. So in cinema, there's much more representation. Television, forget it. It's kind of still a dead end. And just yesterday, there was a big controversy because Televisa is still the largest network in Mexico. They have this comedy show that they make parody of things. So they make a parody of Roma, and then one of the actors did brown face. So kind of, these days in information flows across the border. So some people in the U.S. started commenting, that's problematic. And in Mexico, the actress and the network didn't understand what was the controversy about. And sadly enough, they were putting, black faces and saying, as a way of saying, we just make parody for everybody. So they make it even worse. So
digging the grave.
So again, but at least that created controversy. At least that's now in the table that that those representations are problematic and potentially or rather racist. No, so.
Right. I'll just make the brief comment that one of the things that it's just one little thread of the very rich weave of recent Latin American cinema, is cinemas in which actually indigenous languages become dominant.
Right.
So I do highly recommend to you. What?
Ixcanul from
Well,
Guatemala.
no, Ixcanul from Guatemala. Currently, Birds of Passage from Colombia. Actually, also Embrace of the Serpent from Colombia. And there's actually a film. I don't. You may have shown it here, but I didn't see it from you. Called Guarani from Paraguay. In which it's a road movie in which a grandfather who speaks Guarani wants to go find his daughter who works as a servant in Buenos Aires, and he has to take along his granddaughter who is bilingual in Spanish and Guarani. And as they move along the scale of languages from people who will know any Guarani to moving into a completely Hispanophone world. So this is, there's a group, we're talking about half a dozen to a dozen films that really, thematicizes this aspect.
And also nonfiction, there's a lot of documentaries also tackling on the same topic. There's so many, but off the top of my head.
Well, that's, that's okay. And let's talk about what do you think, this film has so many virtues. And it has been called, I would be in agreement with this, really one of the new humanist masterpieces of cinema. What do you think it shows of Mexican society that really hasn't been shown in this way before? That's a really open. Or am I wrong? I'm perfectly capable of being wrong.
No, I'm going to contextualize also the film. Well, let me just backtrack. First of all, what we have to understand also, Mexico is producing films as never before. Of course, Mexico has a huge tradition of cinema, but nowadays, last year the country produced 170. The previous record from the 50s was like 150. So the country is producing more films than ever. And actually, that's the same case for Latin America. The region produced 900 films. Right. A lot. And lots of great films. An interesting trend in Mexican cinema is that there's a lot of films right now looking back to the 70s and 80s. So in that sense, I would also contextualize this film as part of this trend. And I also think it's part of this kind of change in Mexican politics. Certainly, we're looking back to what has been the last 40 years in Mexican politics and culture, kind of the origins of neoliberalism, and that was hegemonic in Mexico since the early 80s. So there's been a lot of films that are tackling the 70s and the 80s in Mexico. So I think in that sense, Roma kind of it's a good example of that we're visiting the past. To try to understand what's going on in Mexico and where we're headed to. Because also during the campaign, it's funny enough, during the presidential campaign last year, a lot of critics of the current president, then candidate Andrés Manuel López Obrador, was saying that we were going to go back to the 70s, precisely to this time in Mexico. So it's kind of interesting how this film also kind of mirrors the fears, and it's a portrait of that era. So. Mexico is looking backwards right now in terms of where does it want to go next in terms of...
Let me play devil's advocate for a moment and just say, among the people who don't embrace the film, what is it about the film they don't embrace?
The main criticism is that having the protagonist, the maid, but that the film doesn't give agency to the character, that basically things happen to her, but we never really know much of her universe and much of her. And I'll make the plug for actually to recommend a film. There's a new Mexican film called La Camarista, The Chambermaid, which is premiering soon in next month at New Directors New Films at Lincoln Center at the Museum of Modern Art, and it's going to have a theatrical release at Film Forum, which actually I think is a good counterbalance to that criticism of the film. It's about a chambermaid working in a hotel, also sort of darker skinned Mexican woman, and the film, in that sense, gives her a lot of agency, a lot of universe with small narrative devices. So that's I think that's the major criticism of the film in terms of class. However, I think we sometimes, it's when we talk about Roma, it's not only about the film anymore, because the film has become a whole phenomenon. So I personally think and admire the fact that Cuarón has been able to put a Mexican film set in the 70s, black and white, with an indigenous protagonist in the American mainstream. For me, that's a very political act. But that's kind of separate from the film itself. That's kind of around the phenomenon that the film has created, and Cuarón negotiated with Netflix to getting all this exposure. Netflix also spending millions and millions of dollars to get the film seen and to get the Oscar win Oscars. It's become a larger than life thing, just beyond the limits of the film.
Well, I just add to that one of the things that's been characteristic of the three amigos, of Alfonso Cuarón, Guillermo del Toro, y Alejandro Iñárritu, González Iñárritu, pardon, is that not only, yes, you can say they've negotiated Hollywood, and they clearly successfully have, given their awards, given their box office, but they've also negotiated successfully as artists, that they're capable of working in different kinds of genres, and I'm going to say that something like this, but I'm actually going to call this a genre film, because its genre is international art cinema. And if you love a certain kind of international humanist film, this fits in. If you love Italian neorealism of the early 50s, a lot of Italian film. This is, I said to one friend recently in just a little thing, that if you want to see the best Italian film from the 1970s made in black and white that happens to be made in Mexico in the 21st century, please see Roma. Okay.
Right.
Okay. And I mean that as a compliment. It's not that there's anything badly imitative, about it. But they've had this capacity to make something. Just to remind you, his previous film is a science fiction film. One of the great science fiction films of record. It's Gravity. And it is a classical Hollywood film in a number of ways. And by that I mean, it depends upon the kinds of technical devices that only Hollywood has, okay? And the kind of investment it has. It has the classic goal-seeking, problem-solving protagonist who has the worst problems of suspense and death you can imagine, and happens to be a woman, which is a great thing about Gravity. So there's a way in which Cuarón and the other two other amigos, this may sound odd to you folks, but they have careers very much like Spielberg, who will do Jurassic Park and then Schindler's List, because there is this kind of give and take about showing what you can do and then earning your right to make a film that pushes the envelope in different kinds of ways. And I don't think he would have been able to make this film with the resources that make this, this film. He has looked at every grain of this film, of sound and that. And part of that is because Gravity also happens to be a very, very distinguished film of a different kind that made $500 million. Right. And that's what some people say. I would never do a science fiction film, but they've had this flexibility of mind to be great storytellers in different occasions, and that means that a story that everybody would buy into, like Gravity, allows him to make a film like this that some people would say, huh? Right. Family drama, 1970s Mexico, how many $1 million? Are you sure you couldn't do this on your iPhone? So that's one of my great admirations is this simple negotiation that they've been capable of, while always remaining true to the aesthetic that drives them as artists.
Right, totally agree. And even furthermore, I mean, in two different levels. For example, also, you probably read that Alejandro González Iñárritu has been named president of the jury for the Cannes Film Festival for this year. So they've been able to tear down the border, the wall between our house and the commercial cinema, which I think it's in Latin America we have much more of that tradition. of the middle ground between the high and low culture, high art and low art rather, which in Europe and something also in the US, they bite so big. So that's one really impressive thing. They've been able to conquer both Hollywood and Cannes. Roma won best film at the Venice Film Festival. So they've been able to basically again have a successful career in both sides. But also what's interesting about Cuarón particularly, I mean, his biography is very interesting. One, the fact that he's never really lived in LA. He's conquered Hollywood without having to live in LA. He spent a few times when shooting his first films, but he's never really lived there permanently. He used to live in New York, and now he's in Europe for many, many years. And the fact that, he made this film, Solo con tu pareja, in Mexico in 1992, which was a big success in Mexico, and then it premiered at the Toronto Film Festival, got a lot of attention, and that opened doors for him to do work in Hollywood. And he did 3 films in Hollywood, but he was tired of it. After the third film, he thought he didn't have much creativity or much say in the films. It was like Hollywood.
Right. Yeah.
There's a lot of interest. So he decided to go to Mexico to make a more personal film, which was Y Tu Mamá También. So it's funny because it's kind of very schizophrenic. So he made a kind of an art house film in Mexico, which landed him at attention. Then he went to American mainstream, and then he had to break from that. He had to go back to Mexico to make an auteur film that put him again in Hollywood as an auteur. and then his next move was to make Harry Potter.
Right.
So he also challenges also the notion of the auteur cinema, that you have you have to be kind of making the same films. There's not much also room of making different films. And Cuarón, every film is so different from the other. So I also point on that front that Cuarón is also challenging traditional notions of auteur cinema, while at the same time making connections between both.
Right. And I would just say that this, they really break down what people begin as there's this side of the fence and that side of the fence.
Right.
And happily, they're the people who found that there was no wall in between. I would just say that I recommend a film from about 10 years ago, another humanist film, a film called Sugar, which is about a Dominican immigrant who comes on through the baseball system to the United States, and what happens with him. It's widely available. You can, stream, et cetera, et cetera. The reason I mention that, aside from the fact that it's a terrific film in all kinds of ways, is that the couple who are American independent filmmakers who made it, who are wonderful storytellers and craftspeople, when you see the ads on TV for Captain Marvel, they're the people who just directed Captain Marvel. So this model of being able to show that you're a great storyteller, and then to kind of move around and position yourself in these different ways of storytelling. And it's not, just as it's Roma, this deeply personal film, is something made after a science fiction film and after a fantasy film like Harry Potter. Right. Yeah, absolutely the case. So you may have some. We're here. It's easy for us to talk. I think we've just demonstrated. But if there's any questions that you are yes, please, ma'am.
The answer to this question is probably perfectly obvious to everyone in the room but me. Why is the title Roma?
That's a neighborhood where he grew up, Colonia Roma, in Mexico City, which actually is a very popular neighborhood right now, like really hip. It's like I'm older now. I would say Williamsburg, but not even Williamsburg. Like it's like a Bushwick. I don't know. It's like the hip neighborhood.
It used to be, yeah.
Right. It's a hip neighborhood of Mexico City. Just to also a little more context. That neighborhood was severely hit in the 1985 and last year, 2017 earthquake. But it's a gorgeous neighborhood. Has turn of the century buildings and has restaurants, bars. Although I always joke, the film should be called Roma Sur, because actually La Colonia Roma is divided into Roma Sur, north and south, and this happens Roma Sur. So the correct answer should be Roma Sur. But
Okay.
he mentions Cuarón that he didn't have a name for the film, so when his Mexican producer was asking for permits, he would just put Cuarón's Roma as a way, just to give it a name, and kind of stick with it. And I guess also kind of a wink. I mean, you can do a lot of theories, to Italian neorealism, of course, Bellini and.
Yes, ma'am.
One of the awards he won was for cinematography. Can you speak a little bit about the choices, like the way he pans and uses a panoramic and wide-angle way of seeing? Can you talk about how that becomes part of the themes within the film?
Right.
Take it first, and I've got a couple of things, but do it.
Certainly. I mean, the story is that he wanted Emmanuel Lubezki El Chivo to make the photographer for the film, but because the project kind of got delayed, and then El Chivo, who's won 3 Oscars already. Mm-hmm. He's an amazing photographer, and also he's been a key in the success also of Iñárritu and Cuarón. He did the photography for The Revenant and for Cuarón's Gravity and
Terrence Malick's Tree of Life.
Right. And actually, he also did the photography for the Solo con tu pareja. He's worked with Cuarón forever. They went to school together. So when he was not available, Cuarón decided to do it himself. I guess it's public. There's a little controversy in Mexico because there's apparently there was a photographer. His name is Galo Olivares, who worked really closely with Cuarón. He gets a credit as a collaborator and a camera operator. But a lot of people in Mexico have reported that he also worked very closely with Galo Olivares in creating this kind of visual that was closer to what he imagined or what he envisioned. But it's pretty impressive work. No?
So my comment about it is that there is this glorious, wonderful countercurrent in international cinema to the tendency towards ultra-fast cutting in films, in which the number of shots in a film is simply, astounding. The extraordinarily successful American action filmmaker Michael Bay has always said, it's almost as a joke, that his mantra is never hold a shot longer than 3 seconds. And this would be the anti-Michael Bay film.
Right.
But I think, to address your question, I think that's very closely related to his sense of memory, because this is a memory film. That it's an implied memory film. There are certain films, in which we know they're framed as flashbacks or whatever. But this is a film, he talks about in the interviews, and I think as soon as you frame it that way, it makes perfect sense. And for him, memory has this extraordinary material features to it, that memory is everything that comes back. It's not just what person said, it's exactly the place they said it, to whom, in what feeling. And that's why the camera is there for such long takes, and to inspect the circumstances in which everything takes place. And again, we know this house so well. By the end of the film, we feel like, and he said he wanted us to feel like we are dwellers in the house. And again, the tracking camera, the panning camera, the duration of the shots, the way in which obviously he uses depth of field in any number of ways, and uses one of the things that has not been talked about, because it's something that people like us in circumstances like this have the privilege of talking about, but not the Academy Awards. This film is extraordinary in sound design. That is, we are in the neighborhood not only by the selection of objects, the time of day, the textures of this, but we're hearing from all kinds of directions. I mean, the last thing in the film that leads us to the symbol of time will pass, another modernity will arrive in Mexico is the cue, the sound cue to make sure you look at the sky to the jet passing, you know. And so I think there's a real connection between all of those aesthetic decisions about pacing, about camera movement, about, you know, seeing things in depth, multiple points of interest in the frame, are all really part of his conception of memory and the recreation of the past.
And if I can add something, there's also a tradition in Mexican cinema of long takes, better embodied by Arturo Ripstein. I mean, although I think probably I'm the first one to put Ripstein and
yeah, I was about to say.
and Cuarón in the same sentence. But I think, you know, Ripstein also, you know, he's also mastered, you know, long takes, and that's his cinema, basically just one long shot. When they were working with 35mm cameras, where, you know, just last only 10 minutes, also really masterful. But I think there's also kind of a connection there, actually.
And if I can add just one thing to that, the great golden age of Mexican cinema is distinguished by its black and white cinematography, and more than anyone else, Gabriel Figueroa, who again is this master of a kind of Baroque framing in which there's so many points of interest, and in which the lighting design, which may be pretending to be natural, but there's nothing natural about it because it's so beautifully made. So I think it goes back by a couple of, you know, of steps as very much a part of a Mexican cinematic tradition. Yeah.
If I can put another plug, actually, MoMA just announced a retrospective series on Roberto Gabaldon, who is a major Mexican filmmaker, April 25th to May 5th. They're showing like 14 films from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and some of them shot by Figueroa himself. So it's a good opportunity to watch Mexican films in the big screen. You know.
Well, absolutely. And by the way, just to put another historical frame on this, it is also true that this dialogue between Mexico and the United States filmmakers is a very, very long one with selected characters, but they all turn out to be major characters. So that Figueroa shot films for John Ford, and worked in Hollywood, and Ford learned from Figueroa. Ford shot in Mexico. This year is the 50th anniversary of Sam Peckinpah's masterpiece, The Wild Bunch, which not only has a particular vision of American-Mexican relations, but also happens in which Peckinpah casts a number of major, elderly at that point, Mexican directors as characters in the film, as this kind of hidden homage to this intense relationship between, at a certain level, that's, you know, John Ford, John Huston, Sam Peckinpah. It doesn't get better in American cinema than that, and they're all absolutely dedicated to their friendship with Mexico and Mexican cinema, right. And there's this traffic back and forth, including an actor like Pedro Armendáriz, who is the Mexican sergeant in the John Ford Westerns, and is a major Mexican, you know, cinematic presence. Okay. Yes, ma'am, please.
This is just like a comment. I don't know if the director wants to show the relationship between different social classes, between the people who own the places, I mean the kids, and the lady, the Indian girl,
Indigenous.
Indigenous girl, who really portrayed how is her, the way they behave. But I believe also that there were a lot of slavery, you know. Sure. They used the affection, which was very good, especially of the children, but also she always has to be there. She never had a schedule. Right. She didn't go out. The grandmother, when brought her to the hospital, didn't know if she has an insurance, what was her second name. I mean, it is a lot of the way, I mean, the portrait is the real truth, you know? They treat her well, but they treat her well to be a slave.
Hit it, buddy.
Well, couple of things on that front. In the first, I love that sequence when the grandmother goes to the hospital, and also, she has to be served first, and then they ask the name of Cleo,
Yeah.
and she doesn't know. I mean, I think that's like that's a pretty amazing commentary. And also, at the end, also, Cleo saves the lives of kids, and can you make me a milkshake?
Yeah. Can you make me a smoothie?
You go back to your regular.
Are there Twinkies?
Yeah.
Cleo saved us. Can you make us a smoothie? Are there Twinkies? Yeah.
But then, and the second part, and I'm going to be, what would be the word, balconear, showing off or putting my family on the spot. I was in Mexico for the holidays in December. Christmas dinner for 20 people, cousins and aunts and everything. Everybody was talking about Roma. Roma, still kind of the talk of the town. And but I would say half of my family loved it, half of people didn't. And everybody was talking very passionately. But no one mentioned the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room. There was a maid that couldn't go to see her family because, had to help. But nobody made that connection. And that's kind of a tricky part of Mexican, and the figure of a maid is still so complicated in so many levels. So, I mean, slowly but surely, hopefully we'll get to discuss class issues.
Not just Mexico, it's in general.
Yeah, well, it's I think Latin America in general, but it's much more common, say, in Mexico, because it's much more common to have living maids. Like in Argentina, they don't. That's also kind of a class system. If you can afford that living maid, you're really upper class. But Mexico, I think, is much more particular because also Mexico has built like an economy of cheap labor. Right. So it's also really ingrained in the class, racial, financial system. But at the same time, Mexican, and I think that's what kind of the race blind and the class blind. Also what's featured here. You also develop bonds, and there's some solidarity, but that's kind of a false facade for the class struggle. And so it's a very interesting topic.
It is. It differs from country to country, but it's more intense in certain other countries. I will go autobiographical. I was working on a project in Guatemala some years ago. We were housed in a lovely home in Antigua, and the home came with 2 indigenous maids and a gardener. I mean, it's just the assumption that they were there. I mean, I and my roommate did everything to treat them. I found out what the system was. And the system was 10 days on, 3 days off. Which was actually generous, no, exactly, it was generous, and the off meant they were both they spoke a Mayan dialect, and so then they went back. This is why one of the reasons I was interested in the indigenous, because they went back to their Mayan dominant villages, okay, that were in the highlands, and then they came into the city to work for their 10-day stretches, and I had. I had the younger of the maids who was being supervised. They're both lovely, thoughtful women. I asked the supervisor. I said, she's a little bit shy. She doesn't have so many, encounters with gringos. It's as simple as that. And I said, she has her Spanish is very clear, but it has an accent I've never heard before. And she said, well, of course, that's her indigenous accent. And she's shy because not only you're a gringo, but she doesn't really, this is the only place where she speaks Spanish. She has come from a Mayan dominant speaking village. This is her opportunity to actually be in a Spanish dominant world, to master the language and perhaps see where she would go or not from there. And of course, my working companion, who happened to be just a roommate for that. I mean, we as Americans who live without servants. I'm sorry, I'm speaking only for myself, I assure you. We were hypersensitive and curious about this. We wanted to know what their conditions were. We wanted to find out. We found out, for example, excuse me for going on, we found out that the senior she had a son who knew exactly the paths in that country. The next year, either he went to a school that didn't teach English and didn't have computers, or he went to a school that taught English and had computers, and that was the separation moment of his life at the age of 12. Because you go one path, you're more or less charted for, charted for life. So, and just to come back to this film, I completely agree with you that one of the things about this film as a lyrical memory and his obsession with this is getting it all right in his version, which includes the simple portrayal of the contradictions, without a big social plan behind it. But this is how we lived in this moment. You will see contradictions. There's a way in which the film is gently ironic, because he's assuming that we, I think, a particular kind of audience, will see the contradiction between, yes, Cleo saved us, and can you make me a smoothie? And in a forgiving way, because they're children in the 1970s who've grown up in a particular milieu. They don't see the contradiction. But he didn't see it. He talks about it in interviews. And he says, I didn't see it then, I see it now, I just want to show it, and how we experienced that historical moment. So.
Just a fact, Cuarón is the second oldest kid in the film, just for you to know. He's the one that the brother throws the rock at him. He's supposed, Cuarón, the filmmaker, is him, yeah. A lot of people think it's the youngest because he's the cutest, but he's actually not.
Yeah, so he that.
Oh, was the one who was so upset with the father when he learned the father.
The second one, yeah. Yeah. That's Cuarón.
Yeah.
No, that's Cuarón himself in the.
Well, his alter ego. That is, it's who he was at that age.
In the family,
who he was that.
Yeah, because I guess they don't even care. No, I think there's a lot of things to do on that front, because Mexico has over 100 indigenous languages that are rapidly disappearing. That's a big issue in Mexico. It's part of the national debate, but it's still not fully understood by the larger population. Not much has changed in 40 years. I think that those topics should be also pushed more forward.
I have some friends who work as professional translators. I mean, court translators, and so they're part of that world in the whole world. And one of the things that's happened in Mexico is that actually your linguistic rights are guaranteed by certain aspects of constitutional amendment. But it's kind of like a parking ticket. I'm going to say something odd. How many people have debated, do they have enough officers on the beat that I will get a ticket? And the problem is that the rights are there, but they literally don't have enough people to process the languages in the legal system. So you have the right, but how do you find someone who's qualified as a translator for you? In the film that that Carlos mentioned and recommended, Ixcanul from Guatemala, which again is spoken largely in a Mayan dialect. The key figure of who is translating and how that bridge is negotiated between it is one of the key plot points of the entire film.
I Googled, the New York Times just did a series on Mexican documentary shorts, and there's one pretty amazing. I can't remember the name of the short film, but the filmmaker is Sergio Blanco. And it's about this indigenous woman, she's Raramuri from the north, from Chihuahua, that she has an NGO to provide free translation services. Because apparently to the numbers that, the statistics that the short presents, up to 66% of people that have been judged in the state of Chihuahua don't have access to a translator.
Right.
The state doesn't provide that. Interpreter, exactly. Interpreter. So it's pretty eye-opening how, again, things have not changed much. Still a big issue in everywhere, particularly in Mexico.
Small comment. This is the Year of Indigenous Languages, according to the UN.
Well, so it's like,
If Cuarón purposely wanted to highlight.
no, I don't think he was.
Not for that reason, but again, as we said a little bit earlier, it is one of the threads of the new Latin American cinema
Yep.
is highlighting the fact that it's not all Spanish and Portuguese, that is a continent of languages.
Right.
And
That's
that-
important to preserve,
yeah,
really vital
very,
origin
very
to
important to
preserve.
preserve, yeah, okay. Well,
Sorry.
you have one more?
This was just a comment. I once saw an interview with Steven Spielberg. I was always fascinated by his film E.T. And the interviewer was asking, what is the film about? You know, the interviewer was trying to draw him out. Was it about aliens, blah, blah, blah. And Steven Spielberg said something that totally astounded me. He said, no, E.T. is about divorce. And that blew me away. And I thought of that comment while I was watching this film.
Oh, well, you know, that opens a whole other box about, I mean, we've been talking so much about the wonderful made protagonist. I don't even think we have time today to kind of open the
Right.
box of middle-class Mexico, its mores, the way the film portrays the divorce.
Right.
I mean, in so many ways.
But Oscar Gossip, you both brought Spielberg to the table, but actually he's kind of a villain of the story, because he you know, I think he had a major impact for Roma not to win Best Picture. I think it was a big backlash against Netflix. He's been lobbying a lot to change the rules of Academy for not to allow Netflix productions or distribution to compete for the Oscars. And you know, thinking about Spielberg and Audrey's role, I don't remember if you remember in 2006, the year where the Three Amigos label was created, with Babel, Pan's Labyrinth, and Children of Men. At the end, you know, Babel had a big chance to win. At the end, when they announced Best Picture, it was Spielberg, George Lucas, and Francis Ford Coppola coming out to announce the winner, and it was Martin Scorsese. So I kind of read that kind of a, you know what, we're not letting Mexicans take over. So I think, based on his public persona, I think that Spielberg is kind of being very almost reactionary in terms of with this Mexican influx. I mean, but just based on his public, you know, what he says and how has he acted, I think he's kind of jealous of losing power in Hollywood. But that's my own theory.
So, okay, thank you so much. Thank you.